Here we are going to print a linocut block in the U of R studios. So with a small brayer and some Gamblin Relief ink, I am rolling out a thin and even coating onto my carved lino block. We cover the specifics of inks and how to modify them if necessary in another video. But you can see I've put a thin layer of ink on my block and it's more or less now ready to print. So we have to set the press up a little differently than for etching. We set our pressure on this particular press to 1, and we have a different kind of registration system, and we use a different tympan and blanket combination. I've got some tabbed paper. We cover that in another video as well. And I've got my block on a piece of Mylar template with some mat board strips on the side in order to align my plate on the press. And now I'm going to lay down my 2-part tympan blanket combo for printing on this press. The tympan on the bottom is actually just a piece of mat board, and the top is a thin etching blanket. So we're going to roll this through and see what our first proof looks like. We'll get a better look at cranking the press and how to manage the press bed here in just a moment. Generally speaking, anytime I'm printing using registration pins, I only print in one direction, and that is such that the pins go underneath the pressure of the cylinder first, and that just helps me to ensure that things aren't going to come out of alignment while I'm printing. So here's our first impression on our tabbed good paper, and it looks pretty good. I'm going to pick my block up and remove it from the press, and then roll the bed back through to the other side. I don't want to leave my block in place because I don't want to put ink onto the cylinder or, get things dirtier than they need to be. So here you see from a slightly different angle, moving the press bed back to the side I started from. So we're going to go back to the glass here and ink up again, but it's not uncommon when you're printing a lino block or a woodcut in the earlier stages of printing, and sometimes later for that matter, that some of the carved away negative areas begin to collect ink. You've rolled a little unevenly, or the carved away areas are sticking up a little bit too high. And some people like that. It's called chatter. But if you don't, you may want to keep some of your tools like a U-gouge or even a V nearby to carve away in between printing. You can also use a blue shop towel and wipe away little areas on the surface of the negative areas just before printing if you spot them and you don't want to carve. There's a number of ways to do this. Rarely do you ink a plate, set it on the press, and go without thinking about it. So anyways, here is another view from another angle as I set my tabbed paper into place, and I put down my mat board blanket combo. And you'll notice as I turn this particular press, I've got my left hand on the handle and my right hand just very gently holding things in place so that my block and my tympan setup don't skid or move around, causing a slurred and spoiled impression. There's very, very little pressure when you're printing relief compared to, say, etching. So keeping your hand on it and keeping it from moving is a smart idea. So you'll note that I have moved the block again before sliding the bed back to the direction that I started from. There will be some people who might want to print from end to end the way you do with an etching, but again, I find that you run the risk that your paper could move if it is being held by pins at one end and not at the other. So let's have another look at inking from a different direction. I'm going to ink this plate, and in fact, rather than take another impression on paper here, we're going to skip ahead in my editioning, and I'm going to take an impression on a piece of Mylar. The Mylar has been cut to the same size as my paper, and it has been affixed with hanger tabs so that it can go into the registration pins. But everything else looks the same. I ink up the block evenly, smoothly. I'm going for a good, clean impression, and I lay my tabbed Mylar with the appropriate side down, place my tympan and blanket, and carefully run it through the press. The point of printing on the Mylar here is because, as I've mentioned numerous other times in other videos but also in class, having an impression taken on Mylar is really handy for setting up registration and planning out subsequent layers, or if you have to troubleshoot some registration issues you're having down the line. Having an impression on Mylar lets you have effectively a see-through version of your final piece. And there it is. It's not perfect in the sense that the ink is on there smoothly like it is on paper, but it's quite legible. So I'm all done printing this particular block for now. I may want to use it again. I may just be done with it. I may have plans to save it for another time. And the easiest way to at least initially clean your block is to take several impressions on some newsprint or some phone book pages. I sometimes will take 5 or 6 pieces of phone book page and run the block through the press without inking, of course, in between several times, flipping the page over, folding it, and printing it again. A few extra sheets of paper also gives you a bit of extra pressure, which helps to remove the excess ink. So I'm all done at the press here. I'm going to take my tape off. I'm going to take my template, and I'm going to return the press bed back to its center point. I'm going to put away my Timpin and blanket, and I'm going to take the etching press blankets and place them over top as usual. So now it's also time to do the cleanup of my tools and my ink, and if I have any little carved bits, I want to take them off the glass as well. And now it is time to remove the ink from the block. Sometimes the ink comes off, 75 or 80% in that stripping process that we just did with some newsprint, and sometimes it's a little more stubborn and you have to help it out. You don't have to do this, but it's not a terrible idea to clean your block because it helps to preserve it and ensure that it will print reasonably well the next time you go to use it. So I'm using a piece of blue shop towel and a little vegetable oil, and once I've cleaned the whole thing, that's what I'm left with. The negative areas below tend to be a little stained. That's not really an issue. I can finish up cleaning with a small spray of Simple Green on my blue shop towel to remove the last remnants of ink from the surface. If I want to print this again, if I want to carve it as part of a reduction, or I just want to save it in the future and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, I want to keep it flat and dry and in the dark.